pastor at Peace Mennonite Church, and I'm along with Kirsten Coombs. We're members of the Justice Matters Jail Alternatives research team. So we've been working on issues and researching issues of criminal justice for a while now, and we're so excited to have the experts here who have come in to speak to us and to have all of you. This is kind of a little bit of an intimidating group to come before, but I feel really honored and privileged to be in a community where so many of the leaders and stakeholders care enough to give up a weekday evening to come and learn about restorative justice, and I'm glad that we can provide this opportunity for all of you. I do want to go ahead and name the elephant in the room before we go much farther, which I'm sure many of you are aware. Justice Matters has been a leader in the Jail No campaign and continues to advocate for reforms before expanding the jail. Okay. Testing. No. Can you? I don't think this is working.
It doesn't matter. Yeah, it's going a little bit.
Okay. We're a pretty small group. And some of the, there are a lot of different alternatives that we're looking into, things that we're interested in, but certainly restorative justice is one of those items. And one thing I know, there's a lot of concern about the conditions at the jail, and the reality is that building projects take years, and some of these programs towards restorative justice, towards drug treatment, can be implemented in months rather than years. That's one reason that we're interested, not to mention that the costs involved are lower. They're not free, but they're lower costs than brick and mortar construction. So I know we're not all here on the same page about the jail construction, and there may be as many opinions as there are people in this room in terms of what should be done with the floor plan of the Douglas County Jail. That's not what we're here to talk about, but I'm sure it's on all of our minds, and what we decide to do as a community in terms of restorative justice will impact our decisions about the jail. And as hard as it's been to have some of these conversations, and there have been some pretty tense conversations, and I found myself on the other side of the issue from some people I really respect and admire, it has opened up our community to this discussion. People don't tend to come to events like this and sit around and talk about criminal justice reform for no reason. We do it when there's some sort of crisis, and so that the jail overcrowding is, in some sense, the crisis that has brought us to consider these options together. And that's what we're here to talk about today is restorative justice. And as I said, we're really honored to have Dr. Gilbert and Chief Butler here to speak to us. The format of this breakout group will be Dr. Gilbert will speak to us first. He has obviously a different presentation than he did in the general group. And then he's going to run over to speak to the Justice Matters Solutions briefing. And I guess Justice Matters decided if we were going to pay for him to be here, we were going to make him work, right? We've got him doing like 6 different things. So he'll speak, he'll be gone for a while, he'll come back. Chief Mike Butler, who you haven't seen before, he's the chief. You're not just the police chief, it's fire, medical,
Public safety.
Public safety, thank you. So he oversees the police, the fire, and the support services in Longmont, Colorado, and has been key leadership for establishing restorative justice community in Longmont, which has actually spurred Colorado as a state to adopt more restorative policies and approaches. And he'll share some about that with us. And then it's our hope to have 45 minutes or so then at the end for questions, because this is a unique opportunity to have these experts with us. And we want to know what's happening other places, but we want to help you, we want you to be able to ask questions to help you understand how it could impact our community. One person we weren't able to have with us tonight is Dr. Shannon Portillo from KU, or to have Dr. Ruse. And they are working, they have a proposal for a study. And I'm going to need to snag my, I guess it's good that we ran out of pamphlets. It means there's a lot of folks here. But in your packet, you'll find biographies of both Dr. Gilbert and Chief Butler, and then there's an understanding risk, need, responsivity summary of a study that has been proposed by Dr. Danielle Rubes and Shannon Portillo. And the basis of that would be looking at what needs people who are involved in the criminal justice system have and what our community's capacity is to address those needs. And that's a study that has been proposed, is being considered by the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. And then if it's something they think would be worthwhile for the community, they could recommend to the County Commission, who usually takes the advice of the Criminal Justice Coordinating Committee in terms of putting forth studies. So we wanted you all to know that that is a possibility in the community as we're talking about this, because it definitely ties into various restorative practices. So we want Dr. Gilbert to be able to finish here before he has to go to his next place, so we'll turn it over to him to speak to us now.
Thank you. There's a handout that's in this packet that is a PowerPoint. I'm not going to be using, I'm just going to talk about the central issues, but it's there for you. It's prepared in such a way that I hope you can follow the logic, but I will talk about some of the issues. This particular session is focused mostly on the reactive response to harm and talking about how we might do that in a restorative way. Too often we don't think about responding to harm in a restorative way. We think about it mostly in terms of traditional justice, thinking about, what should we do with the person who caused that harm. And I want to reinforce one of the things I mentioned over in the other room is that there are two elements at play here that we have to sort of think of simultaneously. We have to understand that healing the harm between individuals as a response to crime is important. And it can be very, very powerful. I mean, think about yourself and about how you get control. I mean, all of you were students in school at one time, right? And you probably went through a scenario where it was sort of like, shut up, sit down, we're the teachers, you're not. Very controlling. But did that get control? Did it get control? Or did it get resistance? Because it's fundamentally not very respectful to the kids who hear that. And so they react negatively to it. I worked in prisons for 15 years. I found out very quickly that if I tried to be coercive and controlling, I would get just the opposite, the lack of control. It's only when I gave up control that I got control. By giving up control, it means that you begin to understand that soft approaches that appear soft on the outside are actually pretty darn tough, because they tend to work. So if I'm working in my jail cells with my inmates, and I said, hey you, go get the broom and sweep up the floor, we're getting ready for lockup, I get one kind of response. But if I said, John, it's almost lockup time, can you get the broom going? I'll come and join you just as I finish my paperwork. Which one do you think gets more cooperative response? It's the second response. Because that reveals the strength of what we call weak ties. The strength of weak ties is that they generally work because they're relationally focused. I raised the issue of relational justice with two ideas, restorative justice and community justice overarchingly. You all are talking mostly about restorative justice when it comes to justice systems because the word justice is sort of responsive to harm. Being more preventative is sort of the restorative practice side of things, getting ahead of the problem. But the community justice side of this issue is the other piece of that puzzle. And when you're talking about how do you respond to harm in your society or in your community, I hope you also understand that that harm is not evenly distributed across your community. It is highly concentrated. And pay attention to the conditions under which it is highly concentrated. Because if you want to build safe, just, equitable, and sustainable communities, you've got to walk and chew gum at the same time. You've got to deal with the harm between individuals, but you've got to also address the harm that is going on in your communities by the adverse quality of life that is there. The second point that I want to make is that restorative practices, when they are restorative justice practices in our justice system, can be applied anywhere in our justice system. Most people think of them solely as pretrial diversion. That is not the case. Yes, they can be used in pretrial diversion, but they can also be used pre-sentence. They can also be used post-conviction. They can also be used in probation. They can also be used in jail or in prison. They can also be used in pre-release preparation. They can also be used in parole. They can also be used in reentry. So there is virtually no place in the justice system that you cannot apply these ideas. The challenge is the creativity to apply. And then I want to just make one more point. I've been doing this work, trying to get this movement going since 2001, and it's gradually taking off. But along the way, people would say to me, does this stuff work? And I have to kind of flip the question. The evidence, by the way, is that it generally does, if implemented with fidelity to theory, practice, values, and principles. But they don't also ask the same question as what we do right now. And I know the answer to that. I'm a criminologist. I've been looking at this data for 30 years. And the answer is generally no. So the question then comes back to, we can persist in doing things that we are pretty sure won't work, or we can change our lens and begin to think about what might work and how it can work in collaboration with existing justice systems. We're talking about changing the lens through which we see these issues. And this is where I want to invite Chief Mike Butler to begin to explore what's happening in Colorado. It's so exciting what's going on in Colorado. They're implementing these ideas across the state in many ways, but with people like Mike Butler leading the way at the local level.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. Hey, good evening, everybody. I flew in from Longmont today, and I'm not sure we'll be able to fly back tomorrow. We're going to have another cyclone bomb hit Colorado. I never heard of that word until a month ago. It's a pleasure for me to be here. What I don't want to get myself quagmired in is a debate about your jail. And what I don't also want to refer to myself as an expert. I'm just a person with certain experiences, and I'm here to share some of those things. And so, I don't know who's around the table. I was told there's some police chiefs, I was told there's some district attorneys, I was told there's teachers, people in criminal justice system, people in education system, great. So, I've been the public safety chief for 10 years in Longmont. For 15 years prior to that, I was the police chief. 10 years ago, my then boss, the city manager, asked me once the fire chief resigned, did I want to take over fire? In a very weak moment, I said yes. Actually, it's been a growing, challenging experience for me. I have great respect for the fire service that I wouldn't have had unless I would have done what I did. And so I've been overseeing public safety, police, fire. We also have another division, it's a new division called the it's the Division of Community Health and Resiliency. I'll talk a little bit about that too. So, I come at this from the perspective of not just looking at restorative justice, although I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I come at this from the perspective of seeking solutions that seem to be more effective. And so, I am a fan of restorative justice, but I know it doesn't work with everything. I think our criminal justice system, I'm going to go a little bit different than what Dr. Gilbert said. I think it can work. I just think what we've done is we've overloaded, overburdened, and we have just jammed a lot of things into the criminal justice system, so it appears like it doesn't work. So we've taken a lot of health issues, we've taken a lot of social issues, and I'll go further back than what the criminal justice system, how we kind of refer to the criminal justice system in terms of who are the parts of it. I'll go back to elected officials, and I don't know if there's any elected officials in this room, but I've had this conversation with elected officials in the past, whether they be council people, whether they be state representatives, or whether they be federal, Congress, or senators. And I said, you know, one of the things that happens when we run across a social issue is that there's elected officials that want to pass a law to try to fix that social issue. And what happens when we pass that law or we pass that ordinance to try to fix that social issue, we end up invoking our criminal justice system. We say it's up to the police to enforce, it's up to the prosecutor, the DA to prosecute, it's up to the judges to... So we're all kind of in triage mode. I don't know of a part of the criminal justice system in Longmont. And by the way, we're about 100,000 people. And just to give you a little bit of demographics, we're about 30% Latino, 5% African American, and the rest, we have some Chinese, Japanese, and the rest are Caucasian. So we have a relatively diverse community. But we all find ourselves triaging in a criminal justice system. Our DA gets 2,500 felonies a year. They can take 50 of those to trial. So the other 2,450, and I don't think that's probably news to anybody in this room in terms of what you're doing. You know, if you're a DA, you can't take all those cases to trial. Here's the resources you have. Here's how long or short the dockets are for judges. And so our criminal justice system has been jammed up with a lot of health and social issues, namely residuals related to addiction, residuals related to mental health, residuals related to homelessness. Lots of communities have tried to pass different kinds of ordinances to resolve the homelessness issue. That hasn't worked. What we do when we arrest someone who's homeless, typically for a minor crime, is they go in and out of the system, and they can show you their blotted tickets, and typically they're a little bit further disenfranchised. And so it really, we have found that the enforcement of homelessness, and I haven't talked to a police chief yet, and if any of you have read that PERF research study where they went out, PERF is a police executive research forum. It's the closest thing we have to a think tank in policing. If you look at that, you'll see every police chief from small, medium, and large cities say the community thinks homelessness is the police issue. If there's a homeless issue, who do they call? They don't call the city manager typically. They don't call social services. They dial 911. That's who they call. And so in many communities, that homelessness issue has fallen on our backs. So I know I'm going to talk about restorative justice here soon, but I also come from the perspective that I want, that we've done in Longmont, I'll talk a little bit more about that, is we have, with intention, searched for alternatives to the criminal justice system to deal with addiction, to deal with homelessness, to deal with mental health, to deal with youth crime. And so 24 years ago, my best friend, she passed away 5 years ago, Dr. Beverly Title, and I began restorative justice in Longmont. We began it with kids, people under the age of 18. We began it with misdemeanors, and we began it with first-time offenders. We tiptoed into this thing. We didn't jump into the deep end. We stayed there for a year or two and began to really look at the results. Now, the big thing we had to think about, and I'm hoping we can talk about this in a discussion of 45 minutes, is how do you change a police culture that's been school, skilled, and trained in the art and science of criminal justice? That where the only three options are do nothing, summons, or arrest, are typically the options. So how do you change that? Became a real challenge. It also became an invitation. And I don't have enough time in this 20 minutes to talk about that, but maybe we can later. How do you change a community's culture? Because as you heard Dr. Gilbert talk about it in his initial presentation, sometimes the community says, I want justice. Well, what does that mean? That means people want a pound of flesh. That means they want an eye for an eye. Well, we know that doesn't work too. We also know recidivism rates are pretty darn high in the criminal justice system, anywhere from 50 to 70% depending on where you live. And I also have to tell you, if we didn't have the criminal justice system in this country, and someone came to me and says, hey, I'd like you to try something. Here's the criminal justice system, and here's the track record it has. I don't know if any of us in this room would take a 50 to 70% failure rate and say, we want to see this work. But that's where we're at. And I totally agree with Dr. Gilbert in terms of saying, we're not asking the questions we need to be asking of the criminal justice system. And so I know there's been a lot of research done. I can tell you a little research we did in Longmont to try to portray to the community in terms of changing the culture. We looked at 270 people that we arrested for either felony burglary, felony car break-ins, or felony vandalism in 1 year. We looked at 270 people we arrested. And so those are the crimes, for those of you from Lawrence or surrounding areas, you know that the vast majority of crime we deal with is property crime. We also know that we have violence, but we also know that violence is typically committed between people who know each other or allegedly love each other. Domestic violence, family sexual assaults, those dominate the violence in our community, probably most communities throughout our country. So when we look at violence, and when the media looks at violence and they see 150 rapes, many people think those are people jumping out of bushes. It's not. We know that. We know that those things are occurring in our homes or occurring between people who know each other, acquaintances, kinds of things. We know that. And so when people ask me, is it safe to live in Longmont? I say it depends who you live with. And so that's what it comes down to. So we're dealing with mostly property crimes in terms of what we deal with mostly. So 270 people we arrested. We went back and we looked at data systems locally and statewide and around the country. And we found, on average, each of those people had been arrested 9 times prior to the arrest activity. That doesn't surprise anybody in this room. Well, it may surprise some of the teachers or people not necessarily familiar with the criminal justice system. On average, each of those people had 17 charges against them. So here we are in that year arresting 270 people, and we know we've gone back to the well many times. We all know the definition of insanity, and we know that, we keep on doing these things over and over again. Now, one of the things I think the criminal justice system can work. I do. I just think what we're not good at is deciding who needs to be in it and who doesn't. We know that our communities often have psychopathic behavior in our communities. We know that. And we don't have the wherewithal in our society yet, or a pill, or whatever that might look like, to kind of neutralize that. And when people, all they can do, and they can't help themselves, and they're hurting people all the time, well, they need to be separated out. And I'm not a fan of being people. What I'm a fan of is keeping our community safe. I wish our criminal justice system had these 3 goals. This is me, Mike Butler, saying this. I wish the first goal was to keep our community safe. I wish the second goal was to minimize recidivism on the part of the offender. And I wish the third goal was to try to figure out how we can make the victim whole. If we put those 3 goals in place and said, those are our goals for our criminal justice system, I can guarantee you the conversations would change, the strategies would change, and I'm pretty darn convinced that the results would change. So we started Restorative Justice 24 years ago. We kind of tiptoed into it. And so we began slowly but surely working through. We began adding felonies. We've added violent felonies. We've added multiple offenders, first offenders with that. People say, well, you hear this, we got to put this guy back in jail. Well, he's an 8-time loser. We've arrested him, or 9 times. We've arrested that person 9 times. That's why they need to go back to the criminal justice system. So you're telling me we're going to go back to something that hasn't worked 9 times already. That's what you're telling me. That doesn't make sense to me, folks. No one in this room lives your life that way. Your personal life. You don't live where you've done something 9 times and it didn't work and you're going to try it a 10th time. Hopefully most of us do it after 1, 2, or 3 times. And so I'm just letting you know, that's the record of our criminal justice system. And I don't think there's much variation across this country in terms of what those results look like. Because I talk to a lot of police chiefs and sheriffs across the country. So I want to go back to the elected officials for a moment. Oftentimes they'll pass laws, and oftentimes criminal justice system leaders will also say, we need a law. We need a law to fix this. There was a law in our state, Colorado, about 5 or 6 years ago, where there were a lot of law enforcement officials saying, well, we need to make the 4th DUI a felony in our state. We are only one of 4 states that didn't have that kind of law. And so that became the reasoning. We're only one of 4 states. Well, we have a researcher on board in Longmont, and I said, Elise, go out and find out from those 46 states what kind of impact that DUI law is having. And she found that the accident rate didn't go down, the deaths didn't go down, but we had a new law in the books. And so we didn't look at addiction. We didn't look at what's underlying the issue. The legislator passed a law saying we're going to make DUI, the fourth conviction, a felony. And so somehow we sent this message to our community, to our state, of about 5.7 million people, that we're going to fix the DUI issue. Well, I think unwittingly what we did was we undermined communities and we undermined people for taking responsibility at some level for these issues. Because people know that this person's suffering with an addiction. They know. And so we get up and we say we're going to pass a law, we're going to stiffen penalties, as if we're going to create an insurance policy that's going to protect us from the human condition. We know that doesn't happen. We know that doesn't happen. So, what can we do differently? Well, I'm just going to give you a real quick litany of what we're doing in Longmont, and I'm going to focus a little bit on restorative justice. So, we changed the culture within Longmont. We started changing it 24 years ago. We wanted ultimately to be able to give our police officers lots of options to deal with the messiness of the humanness that they encounter every hour of every day. We know that the hammer, we all know that the hammer is typically the only choice we have, and we know there's a lot of other tools that we can invent, put in the toolbox. So I will just tell you, the advent of restorative justice in Longmont was key in changing our culture and getting our officers to see that there were other ways of doing things. Along the way, we put a program in place called the Angel Initiative. The Angel Initiative is, if you're struggling with an addiction, a chemical substance addiction, you can walk through our doors and we will find you a treatment provider. We now have agreements with over 100 different treatment providers who provide free treatment to people. And in 2 years, 145 people have walked through our doors and we have found every one of them treatment. We know we're just we're just nipping this right now. But what we do know now is that Longmont is no longer a community where you have to have the financial wherewithal or insurance to get treatment for your addiction. The vast majority of those 145 people who came in don't have insurance and don't have the financial wherewithal. And so I think communities can do that. And frankly, for those around the table who are with criminal justice or police or fire especially, maybe not fire, but police in that arena, I think we have this incredible legitimate platform to create change in our communities. And so we started the Angel Initiative. In the last couple of years, we've also started programs like LEAD, Law Enforcement Assistant Diversion Program. It's a harm reduction model. We also started CORE, which is a co-responder program for folks struggling with their mental health. And in essence, real quickly, those two programs, LEAD is about if you're struggling with an addiction and you've committed a crime, depending on the crime, we don't do it with all crimes, you can have a choice of getting into this LEAD, this kind of harm reduction model, or you can just be arrested and go to jail. Co-responder with mental health, the same thing. So what we've done in our officers, I have to tell you, the other day, one of the commanders of the patrol division came up to me and basically said, if we took away CORE and LEAD, you'd have a mutiny on your hands. That's how much our officers like it and need it. That division of community health and resiliency has case managers, has clinicians, has mental health, addiction treatment clinicians, has paramedics, and has police. We have police officers standing in line to get in that division. So we're looking at mental health and addiction much more proactively right now. Because we all know when we start looking at the kinds of things we respond to as police or what the criminal justice system has to deal with, and which entity is the biggest mental health board in our counties or in our country, we know that we're it. And so who do people call when these issues happen? They call the cops. And they expect the criminal justice system to somehow work magic. So, I wanted to say one other thing on that, but I'm going to go back to restorative justice real quick. So in 24 years, our officers have referred over 6,000 people to restorative justice. We're a town of 100,000 people. it's not an equal number of victims. I'm going to say there's probably 3,000 to 4,000 because oftentimes we're looking at 2 or 3 offenders per case. And so it's maybe 3,000 or 4,000 offenders. And then we have community representatives who also help out in terms of saying, you know, this is not just a crime against victims, it's also a crime against the community. And so there's community representatives. The people who facilitate these conferences within Longmont are community residents. They're just citizens. We train them to do that. And so this is a real community-based model in Longmont. The service provider is called the Longmont Community Justice Partnership. And they're the ones who basically provide this service. So, I don't know if you can say the proof's in the pudding, but the recidivism rate has, over those 6,000 offenders, has been less than 10%. The satisfaction rate of victims, we all know that victims don't have a legal provision to have their voice heard in the criminal justice system. In our restorative justice model, the victim's voice is the centerpiece. We know that in the criminal justice system, we have the right to remain silent. That's a sacred right in our country, there's no question. In the restorative justice process, you have to choose accountability. And so, I think when people choose accountability, can repair the harm, can develop a relationship, and can do those kinds of things that they didn't have an opportunity to do in the criminal justice system, I think that lends itself a lot to why recidivism rates are so low. We know, as leaders in our organizations, that we can demand accountability, we can try to legislate accountability with policies, rules, we do that in our country with laws, or we can try to purchase accountability. What I like about restorative justice is that people get to choose accountability. And that's one reason why, I think, a big reason why the recidivism rates are as low as they are. And then the community satisfaction rate is significant. So, over the years, we've changed the culture within Longmont because we have added a lot of other options for our officers to consider. We also have an option now called Rewind. And it's for kids. And we started off 3 years ago saying, we don't want to arrest or summons our kids for the vast majority of things that we arrest and summons them for. That's about 1,000 kids a year in our community, thereabouts. We want to be able to put our kids through this program called Rewind, which includes restorative justice and the wraparound services of mental health, addiction, or other kinds of services. And so we've lumped a lot of things together in Rewind for our kids. And so we just did last year was our pilot year. We did maybe 150 to 200 cases. We didn't want to, again, jump into the deep end. We were kind of tiptoeing. But the success was incredible. It was incredible. So, the community culture around restorative justice has changed dramatically. One of the things that we did was we took a lot of high-profile cases where people thought, well, they're going to go to jail, we're going to throw the book at them, and we actually referred them to restorative justice. And what we did with that was, the community was aware of these cases, and when they were aware of these cases, they said, what's going to happen? And so we had to convince the victim had to say yes to this, the offender had to say yes to these kinds of crimes. We did it in a serious car break-in situation where hundreds of cars were broken into by 4 kids. We did it with a case involving cemetery vandalism. The vandalism was like $75,000, and that really got the community upset. And so when we did that, the community was paying attention. Well, afterwards, the victims came out and said the restorative justice model worked. We haven't seen these kids again. In either case, we haven't seen them again. In both cases, the victims went in angry at the offenders. In both cases, they came out thinking, how can we be part of a mentoring program for these kids? So there's a lot of magic there that works that, frankly, I think we don't get that opportunity in the criminal justice system. So I think that's what I'm going to say for now. And I don't know when Dr. Gilbert's coming back, but I'm definitely open for discussion, questions, whatever that might look like.
Questions, and Dr. Gilbert will come back. This is probably obvious to you all, but I neglected to say earlier that we are videotaping. That is primarily for people who aren't able to be here that want to hear what's said. It was a scheduling error in a sense on our part. The County Commission is meeting tonight, and they are of course interested in this topic, and we have promised them they will have access to these videos, and there may be others interested as well. So that's why the cameras are rolling, and you're now welcome to ask questions that you might have, and when Dr. Gilbert gets back, he'll join in.
Go, fire away.
Well, it seems one of the ways we've gotten into this mess is it's always easier for politicians to say, I'm tough on crime, my opponent is soft on crime. And just, it seems like the ratchet has just been turning and turning and turning, where now we're putting more of our, just nationally, we're putting more of our citizens in jail than almost any country in the world. How do we turn that ratchet back, and how do we do it so that it doesn't look like you're being soft on crime when you take this approach?
That's a great question. And you're right on some of the history there in terms of 3 strikes and getting tough on crime. That's been the mantra of a lot of our elected officials over time. And frankly, I was certainly not in favor of that, but I will tell you one thing that I do, and that is that when someone asks me, state officials come to me or local officials come to me and say, what can we do, what kind of laws would you like to see passed? They know they don't come to me anymore because I say, no, anymore. I just don't, because we never know the unintended consequences of those things. So I also think in Colorado, we are shifting. We're making that shift. It's slow. That Titanic kind of boat is turning slowly. But I also think our communities want to feel safe. I also think they want us to be effective. And I think that's the message that I'm sending to our community, and a lot of others are sending, not just me, in terms of what is effective, in terms of keeping our community safe. And, you know, we can arrest people until the cows come home. And we know that that just hasn't worked. The second part of your question? Who are you, by the way?
Oh, I'm Bill Scholl. I'm the social justice consultant for the Archdiocese of Kingston, Kansas.
Okay.
Restorative justice is a very key principle in Catholic social teaching. So thank you for
You're welcome.
Yeah, I think my second part was really sort of how do elected officials maybe market this or inoculate them against this accusation that I mean, basically, how do you protect yourself from the Willie Horton effect?
Well, you know, each elected official has to figure out what they're going to do that brings integrity and authenticity to their campaign and their work that they're doing. We know that elected officials want to get elected, want to get reelected, and we know that there's politics involved. We know those dynamics are alive and well, but I'm convinced that we can have more discussion. You know, this is just something that happens in Longmont. By the way, it's not just happening in Longmont, it's happening in several communities. We're probably the more robust program in the state of Colorado, but it's happening in several communities in Colorado. We now have a state legislator named Pete Lee out of Colorado Springs who has championed a lot of legislation related to restorative justice and has gotten other legislators on board with that as well. So, yes?
I'm Tony Wheeler, I'm the city attorney for Lawrence, and I was interested to hear more about your Angel initiative and the dependency treatment that Longmont is able to offer. How is that funded?
So here's what's interesting about it. We have 100 different addiction treatment service providers we have agreements with. They do this for free. We've leveraged probably over the last 2 years $2.5 to $3 million of free addiction treatment, including residential treatment, including intensive outpatient treatment. We've gotten 40 different employers to agree to employ people who are in recovery. And so if you come back from treatment and you need a job, we have a community group that helps people with housing or helps people support. They're not sponsors in the AA kind of way. And so we have a lot of community support for this. We have a lot of employer support. We have a lot of addiction treatment support. And what we do, interestingly enough, when someone walks through our doors, we treat it like a call for service. One week the police department handles it, the next week the fire department handles it. And you're going to ask, how did you get the fire department to handle that? That's an entirely different story. But on the other hand, they're part of this too. They are part of the Angel Initiative, they're part of LEAD, they're part of CORE. We know that the vast majority of what fire departments do across America is emergency medical services. And so this kind of falls right in their bailiwick. Now I went around to all the stations and I talked to all of them and I said, listen, we can continue to respond to these EMS calls. We can continue to respond to people struggling with addiction or struggling with their mental health or struggling with homelessness, or we can do something that's more proactive and preventative. And so they became a big part of it. So we treat it as a call for service. And then we have an application process. If you have warrants for your arrest, that doesn't help. We've worked with judges over time to get them to dismiss warrants when people want a treatment. Some things we just can't get them dismissed. They got to deal with their warrant before they can come back. But ultimately, with the Angel Initiative, and I want to talk about LEAD and CORE. LEAD and CORE were funded by, you know it's legal in our state. The marijuana tax has funded this LEAD and CORE program. We're one of only 2 cities in the state of Colorado that got both of those. We've hired 17 people. That's our division of community health and resiliency. So we've got like $3.5 to $4 million in grant money. So all 3 of those programs, we were able to change our response model, and this is where it's at. We have not, the city has not had to pay a dime for those. So because what I believe in, one of the things I could talk for a long time about is the magic or the incredible nature of social capital. I call social capital the community's gifts, their talents, their resources, their skills, expertise. We have 100,000 people in our community. Lawrence, I've heard, has about 100,000 people as well. What I'm convinced of is that everybody in our community has gifts. Oftentimes, they just don't know how to offer them. Oftentimes, they're not asked. Oftentimes, service providers or public safety people say, we got this, we're trained, we're the only ones that can do this. At some level, we've monopolized or put a chokehold on who can provide these kinds of services. I'll tell you another little thing that I do, and that is I walk neighborhoods every Sunday morning in our community. Mostly mobile home parks, mostly apartment complexes, areas where you wouldn't think the social capital is all that robust. Well, guess what, folks? I was pleasantly really surprised. These people, when you look at Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they're trying to figure out how to deal with shelter, they're trying to deal with food, safety. But when you ask them, would you like to make a difference in your community? It's amazing how their eyes light up. It's amazing what happens. And so I'm trying to make a case in Longmont. It's a tough case to make. That I think social capital has as much importance as revenue capital. And so oftentimes government people, when they get together and talk about a new program, it's not too much further than the first paragraph where people say, how are we going to fund this? And so what do? That's often the case. I think we need to ask another question, and that is, how do we get the social capital to make this work? And so I just don't walk those neighborhoods by myself. A very good friend of mine, Dan Benavides, who speaks Spanish, I don't, because we have a lot of Spanish-speaking people in our community. We walk those neighborhoods. And I have to say, 80% of the people we've asked, we've walked 200 neighborhoods in the last 5 years. July of 14, that's when we started walking neighborhoods. And by the way, we're not the only ones. Police officers and firefighters and other professional, we call them professional, we don't call them non-commissioned staff. I don't want to call anybody a non. We call them professionals. Professional staff are also walking neighborhoods. And they're excited about this. Our motto is policing in partnership with the people, kind of the same with fire. They know that we have to have a partnership. So our goal is to figure out how to do a lot of these things without going back to the city and saying we need more budget. And so we've been able to do that with those 3 programs. The Longmont Community Justice Partnership that provides restorative justice service That's not ours. That's outside, and Beverly and I made it clear that we wanted this to be a community-based process. We didn't want it being run by government. Not that government can't do it right, it's just that we thought in order to change the culture in our community, we needed to have a community-based restorative justice process. So I will tell you, I gave you some numbers before. There's around 15 to 20,000, that's a swag, I know, people in our community that have been exposed to restorative justice in our community. That's how you change a culture around. How do you define justice? You define justice as a pound of flesh, or an eye for an eye, or do you define justice as relationship repair? Choosing accountability, compassion, grace, forgiveness, apology. I'm convinced that those forces are in our midst. Our challenge and invitation is to figure out how to identify those forces, how to harness those forces, and how to leverage them for the good of the whole. And I do believe that those forces, and I have lots of evidence to show this, have more impact in terms of sustainability around accountability than the force of retribution or the force of being punitive. And so you look at recidivism rates, you look at victim satisfaction rates, you look at safety of the community. By the way, we're the second safest community in the state of Colorado, over 75,000 people. The safest community is a gated community, frankly, that I think if you threw the Wall Street Journal onto the BMW, that might be considered a crime. so anyway, it's a very wealthy community. And so our community is one of the poorest communities in the state of Colorado. We have more social services per capita than any other city in our county, which includes Boulder, Colorado, and includes other smaller cities, 30,000 to 40,000 people. So I know I went on and on and on, but if you're imaginative and resourceful enough, you can figure these things out. And so I believe these, and you know, you can call these forces anything you want, but I'm just going to kind of tell you where I'm coming from. I think they're spiritual forces. And I often think when we're dealing with these issues in our community, the issue, and if anyone's been around this business, it's getting worse. It seems like it's getting worse. I think we're trying to fill the spiritual vacuum with a lot of secular responses. I really do. And I think those forces, when you start being able to harness and leverage them, can make more of a difference. Now, I won't talk any more about that. I just won't say any more about that. But you got a little hint about what I'm about in terms of what I think. Our faith communities are amazing. I think it's amazing that Justice Matters has, I don't know, 22, 23 different churches engaged, thousands of people in those congregations that are willing to make a difference. I don't know Randy's last name. Randy is, he's got a little goatee. He picked me up at the airport. We had this incredible conversation between the airport and here. And so he was telling me a little bit about Justice Matters. Lawrence is fortunate to have that Justice Matters in their mix. They are very, very fortunate to have that. And I know that to the criminal justice folks, that sometimes the professionals, the systems people, can be somewhat maybe a little bit threatening, perhaps, I don't know. But if every community had a Justice Matters and kind of forced the issues the way that I heard Randy say that Justice Matters is forcing the issues, all it does, what I believe in are new conversations around things. You know, Dr. Gilbert someone talked about possibilities. Oftentimes we go to this mode of problem solving. Problem solving fixes the past. When you think about possibilities, you're thinking about creating a future that doesn't exist. You're thinking about something you want to live into. You're thinking about something that transcends old failures, old successes, old stories. I think we've got to think more in terms of possibilities. I think that's where we have to go. That's why that's why we're doing the things we're doing. What is possible with this? And I think Justice Matters is a great organization, it seems to me, I don't know everything about it, from the outside looking in, that can talk more about possibilities. You can't problem solve transformation. You can't problem solve intention. You can't problem solve community. You can't problem solve those things. People have to feel something here before they're going to respond. And so these walks that Dan and I do, and that our police officers and firefighters do as well, we call it the belonging revolution. We encourage people to believe and feel they belong to our community. If they feel they own our community because they belong to it, if they feel that this community belongs to them because they belong to it, they're more likely to make an investment and take care of it. So we've put, those are the things, kind of the things we're doing. Those are the experiences that I'm sharing. And so, for whatever it's worth. So I know that's a long answer to your budget question. So for me, it's the segue to the value of social capital. And those programs I mentioned serve as leverage points for social capital for engaging our community. All of them are designed so that the community can be a part of it. And so very much a part of it. And that's the social capital that we think really makes a difference in our community. Other questions? Other thoughts? Yes, sir.
I've got a question for you. I'm Charles Branson, I'm the district attorney. I guess partially clarification. Kind of looking at our jurisdictions, they sound like they're a little bit somewhat similar. Your demographics are a little bit different than ours, but we're both about 100,000 people. I believe you said earlier that you filed somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,500 felony cases.
Not from Longmont, from Boulder County, from all the county.
Okay.
From the whole county. I should have said that and I didn't. That includes Boulder, that includes Longmont, that includes all the other cities, that includes unincorporated Boulder County.
Okay.
Chief, is that about 300,000 folks in Boulder County?
350 to 400 now. It's a weed. It seems to be a destination point. And frankly, the people experiencing homelessness, a lot of people came to Colorado when we legalized marijuana. And we experienced a lot of that in Boulder County. Quite a bit. It was amazing how many people showed up in this state, showed up in Boulder County, and showed up in Longmont. And we legalized that. So I'm sorry, your question.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you for the clarification. So I guess one of the things I wanted to ask, I know this is probably, since it's not going to be county-wide, in your jurisdiction, do you have any sense or any resources or data collected that would suggest or tell us whether or not your rate of arrest or your criminal filings have decreased?
They've decreased. They have decreased. And I can send you some information. At one point, I may have these numbers a little wrong, the deputy chief said we comprise like 40% of the Boulder County jail's population. We're down to less than 20.
Yeah. I think that'd be really helpful to law enforcement in the room or others that are interested in this issue.
Yeah.
If you do have those resources.
We have those numbers. They actually come out of the Boulder County jail.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
So my name is Scott Miller, I'm the Municipal Judge, and I wanted to ask you some questions about your recidivism status. Specifically, you said 10% was your recidivism rate. When I heard that number, I wanted to know whether that was the number of people who completed your process or the amount of people who started the process.
Well, thank you for the clarifying question. So in each of our processes, we have a requirement that the offender has to complete a contract. He has a voice in what the contract looks like, and so does the victim, and so does the community. So basically, those three entities figure out what a contract is. Most of the times, those contracts take 2 to 3 months to complete, on average. Our recidivism rate goes out 1 and 3 years in terms of recontact by police. And so that's where those recidivism rates, after 1 year and after 3 years. And I gave you the 3-year 10%.
Do people ever fail during the
Oh yeah,
process?
oh yeah. And I know this is going to get legal real quick here. But what happens when they fail, in terms of what happens when they come back to the police, and the police will either issue a summons or make an arrest.
Do you know what percent fail?
10%, a little less than 10%.
I mean, out of the process itself, not the recidivism
Oh,
rate or the same.
You know, I don't have that number. I'm going to say it's less than 10%. I don't have that number.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Kathy, mediator attorney. Do the schools also do the peer mediation and conflict resolution in their community too, so that it's...
We have a superintendent that is very much in favor of restorative practices and principles. And so I will say that our school district has ebbed and flowed a little bit depending on who the superintendent was. We have people in every school, though, that are staff trained to deal with restorative justice. We have a lot of kids that are staff trained. We have a process now where in one of the high schools, we have 3 high schools, where in one of the high schools where the kids actually conduct a restorative justice process. And so, and a long time ago, frankly, we dealt with their discipline system. We went to a former superintendent who we said, would you mind, would you care, would you think about making the discipline process more restorative? So they revamped their discipline process to make it more restorative in that way. So our schools are heavily involved, our kids are heavily involved, and so that's, I don't know if that answers your question. That's
I would think it would require that to have a whole community approach.
So, you know, Beverly and I had this dream of creating a restorative community. We called it that. I've actually used restorative principles for discipline cases. I've actually used restorative practices and principles for conflict resolution cases. And our officers are okay with that. I had a very serious case with 2 of our officers and officers from 2 other departments. I won't go into the details, but our officers were definitely in the wrong. Both the chief and the sheriff and those other 2 departments agreed to go through a restorative justice process. The officers did as well. And basically we ran a restorative process on something that initially could have ended in termination. It could have gone that way. And it ended in a restorative process with a lot of relationship repair. They also had to put a contract together in terms of what they had to do in order to amend the things that they did. And so it can be used a lot. The restorative principles and practices can be used for a lot of things. Other comments, questions? Yes, sir.
My name is Les Logan. I'm the police chief in Eudora. I was curious.
Police chief, I'm sorry,
What? Excuse me?
where at?
Eudora, Kansas.
Okay.
I was curious, does the funding you receive from the legalization of marijuana, does it help? Does it outweigh the problems that it's brought also with the homeless?
That's a great question, Chief. We could have a long debate, maybe conversation around the legalization of marijuana. We've seen negative residuals from that. But I will say this, I side more with dealing with the demand than I do with, we have a narcotics unit that works pretty heavily in large operations around schools and open air dealing. That's typically their goals and purpose. But we also know that we can dismantle a fairly large organization that's distributing fentanyl. We just spent $10,000 the other day for, I don't know how many fentanyl pills. Spent $10,000. Actually, the DEA spent weird forward. But we can dismantle a large illicit narcotics organization, and we know within a matter of months, we can take them all, make it large sentences. Within a matter of months, that organization is going to be rebuilt by other people. We know that. So it gets into, okay, what's important here? And so we've been trying to deal more with the demand. That's where I go, more with the demand. That's why we put the Angel Initiative in place. But we also know there has been, I'll get to your question, but there has been negative residuals from marijuana. We know there's been more DUIs with marijuana. And so the tax money, I'd have to say, I bet if our cops were here, they would say it far outweighs, what we're doing far outweighs the legalization of marijuana. In terms of the number of people we've impacted with LEAD, with the Angel Initiative. You know, one of the things I didn't talk about with LEAD and the Angel Initiative, I'll just give you three guys, Rubio, Vesubio, and Anson. Together, 1,000 calls for service over a period of a year. And I know you have those folks, and Lawrence, you probably have some of those folks in your community. I was told by Randy that you have a homeless issue in Lawrence as well. We arrested 1,000 people last year, or summoned 1,000 people last year for homelessness. We didn't have any choice about what to do. They weren't willing to take accountability. We put a lot of those people eventually got into either LEAD or the, not a lot, but some of those people got into either LEAD or the Angel Initiative. But, where was I going with that? We didn't, we see, Vesubio, Anson, and Rubin, 1,000 calls for service. They all went through the Angel Initiative, and now they're somewhat in LEAD where they're being case managed. They've gone down to maybe 100 calls for service. We've seen that kind of impact. And I know that, you know, we work on a lot of super users, frequent flyers of the system. And that's where LEAD, CORE, and Angel Initiative really focuses. And so we've been able to reduce a large, that's just 3 people. We've been able to reduce a large number of calls for service for those kinds of things. So our officers are seeing that, and they, like the commander said, if we chose to deal with CORE and LEAD and say, well, we're not going to do it anymore, we'd have a mutiny on our hands, because they end up doing a lot of calls for service that the patrol officers won't do, because there's officers involved with that as well. So, I don't know. I think your returns are still early, Chief. I still think we're going to have to wait a little while longer. You know, I think there was some legislation in our state, I don't know where it's at, I don't know where it's going to go, to make certain kinds of possessions that were one-time felonies, misdemeanors. We're starting to see a trend. I think it's going to come across the country, not just ours. And I don't know if this makes our country worse or better. I don't want to get into that qualitative value kind of question. But if we go down this path of saying, okay, we're going to deal with the demand, we're going to legalize some of these drugs, what will happen? I mean, I think it's anybody's guess at this point. I can tell you that the war on drugs didn't work. It didn't work. It flat out didn't work. I could sound like Carl Sagan, billions and billions and billions of dollars, lots of money spent, further disenfranchisement. It helped develop or support cartels in another country. And so that's been our response. I personally think our response needs to shift to something, those forces in our midst that are much more powerful, I think, than being punitive. Now, I will say this, we arrest a lot of people, we summons a lot of people. We're not there yet where we got this balance perfect, where we know who needs to be in jail and who doesn't. But we give our police officers the leeway to make decisions about what needs to happen to people. You just don't have to arrest, you just don't have to summons. There's lots of other resourceful things we can do outside of LEAD, CORE, and the Angel Initiative, Restorative Justice too. So that's kind of where we're at with things. And so our community is a safer community. And so there have been a lot of things. I will tell you, I don't know if you know what Part 1 crimes are, but they're the more serious crimes tracked by the FBI. They include arson, burglary, theft. That's not real serious, but car thefts, sexual assaults, robberies. I think I got most of them there. At one point, 15, 16 years ago, we were hovering somewhere between 5,000 and 5,500 Part 1 crimes a year. Last year we had 2,900. And so, and our officers will attribute a lot of that to what they're doing different in our community. So, yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is David Trevino. I'm an immigration attorney and also a criminal defense attorney. I'm just curious about your numbers. You mentioned that about 20% of those incarcerated in the county jail are from Longmont. Of that 20%, what's the ethnic breakdown of the people incarcerated?
Great question, and thank you for asking. And I don't know the number. What I do know the number of is arrest and summonses. That we have like a 30% number of Latinos in our community, and the last I looked, we were at 32%.
And as
For
far
arrest and summonses.
Okay. And as far as implementing and applying the restorative justice, is that applied evenly among the different ethnic groups, or that's a concern of mine? And then thirdly, are there the resources available to deal with restorative justice with that Hispanic community?
Oh, yeah.
in Longmont?
In fact, they've rallied around this. We have two different Latino advocacy groups, one in particular called El Comité, that has rallied around restorative justice for us, and have helped us along that way as well. And by the way, when Dan Benavides and I walk neighborhoods, the vast majority of neighborhoods we walk are Latino neighborhoods. And because sometimes we wonder, Dan, as much as I do, whether or not they really feel like they belong to our community. So we spend a lot of time in those neighborhoods. So I just wanted to add that piece to it in terms of, I appreciate your advocacy for the Latino community, and those are the numbers, and that's what we're doing with restorative justice. And by the way, we have a number of, I don't know if you'd like to hear this stuff or not, but I'm just saying it because this is what we're doing. We have a number of people who are undocumented. We know that. And one of the things that Dan and I tell them is that, and I've seen a number of these, I know a number of people who are undocumented. We know we don't have any authority to deport. We know that. And we don't see it as necessarily, we don't see it as a local issue. And we're not signing up for any 287G program where we're partnering with ICE. That's not part of our repertoire, not even close. But we let people know. And I can tell you, I remember several people work in neighborhoods. They're undocumented, been here for years, but they're great neighbors. They raise kids. They work for a living. They do various things in the community. And frankly, I think they make democracy work. I think they make democracy work. And we let them know that they feel that they have the right to belong. And by the way, a number of them have signed up to help out in terms of doing more in our community. So it wasn't always like that. I will tell you, it wasn't always like that. In 1980, Longmont experienced, long before I got there, but Longmont experienced a young officer, months after hire, shot and killed 2 Hispanic boys, shot them in the back. And if that would happen today, it'd be Ferguson times 100. But it happened in 1980. Our town almost burned down, but this friend of mine, Dan Benavides, who's the first elected Latino in our community, and who started this group, El Comité, a Latino advocacy group, frankly, kept the town from burning down. And so we're a much different community, much different department than we used to be along those lines. And so we appreciate the richness of the diversity we have in our community, and we've taken a lot of proactive efforts to include them and to offer them opportunities to create as level playing field as we can, and to maybe most importantly let them know that they belong to the rest of us. Yes.
Would you talk a little bit more about officer training and how that's evolved since you
Yeah.
have?
Well, all of these things that I talked about are part of our. So let me go a little bit before training. It's hiring, recruitment, hiring, and selection. Maybe the most important process and system that we have in our police departments. We really look for people who are life experienced, who have experienced rejection, disappointment, failure. They're no longer the center of their universe. You got to be a grown-up person to do the job of a police officer. You really have to be. And so we also look for people who are relationship oriented. I don't want to hire lone cowboys or people who are rugged individual achievers. I'm not interested in those folks. I'm interested in people who really thrive and get a lot of great energy in relationship. And I can think of 3 people right now. One's the commander of the SWAT team, one works in the Special Enforcement Unit, one's my deputy chief. And there's many, many, many others. But when people are relationship oriented in their lives, their resiliency, their strength, their capacity to kind of see different pictures, and maybe even a bigger one, is, I think, significantly greater than people who kind of want to have this rugged individualistic kind of approach. And so we pay a lot of attention to the people we hire. Spirit of service versus spirit of adventure. We're not looking for people who need an adrenaline fix. Great communicators. Most of them have college educations. The average age is like 31, 32. We have intern programs. We have explore programs to help people. We have citizen academies where we go into 3 high schools, and for a semester, police officers go into those schools and they teach for that day, for the school. So we do that every year, every semester at 3 different schools. And so we put a lot of focus on trying to kind of cultivate our own, so to speak, in terms of what we need, what we want. And we talk a lot about what we're looking for in a police officer and the nobility and the honor that comes with that profession and how rewarding it can be. And I know the media's done a number, and I don't know if there's media folks in the room. I think I probably offended a few people. But on the other hand, we try to give people a different perspective of what it's like to be a police officer. And I'm concerned that our sons and daughters, whether it's the millennials or whatever it is, are going to be less inclined to join into that kind of profession. I try to convince my fellow police chiefs where I work at PERF, I guess that's my cue, huh? Okay. I try to convince, I do a lot of engaging with fellow police chiefs around the state run, and I try to convince my fellow police chiefs that we need to recalibrate, reset, rethink who we are, and that we need to become less reactive, less the enforcement kind of look. We need to figure out how we can become more proactive, how we can become part of a community where we're solving these kinds of issues. I think the millennial generation is much more drawn, because while I've heard millennials are still attached by their umbilical cord to their parents, so to speak, I also heard their social responsibility index is through the roof. And so, what are they going to be drawn to? What are they going to be attracted to? They're drawn and attracted to organizations and professions that really are involved in those kinds of things, where they're making differences in people's lives. And so, I want to tell you another thing, real quick, I'm going to go back to restorative justice. Here's what I think cops are really drawn to. I think I think police officers understand and what resonates for them. Number one, the victim. We see victims like no one else in the system sees victims. We know that. We see the raw truth of what happens. By the time the prosecutor, the DA, or the judge gets a hold of it, they look at the situation looks entirely different. We know that. And so they're drawn, and so what they see in restorative justice is that the victim's voice is the centerpiece. That is huge for our police officers. It's big. The other thing that they're drawn to is this accountability piece. They're tired of arresting the same people over and over again. And the definition of insanity doesn't even apply. Definition of insanity is doing things over and over again, expecting different results. They don't even expect different results anymore. It's futile to them to know that they're going to arrest this person over and over and over again. And so they're drawn to accountability. They're drawn when people select accountability and sustain it. That is powerful for our police officers. And that's what drew a lot of them in. I had a police officer who basically came up to me and said, "Chief, I'm just going to tell you the story because this is what's happening. This is what I did. I restorative justice when you first started. I hated it. I didn't want it. I thought it was soft and fuzzy, and this is BS, and here's what we got to do. And I tried to sabotage the restorative justice process by giving them an incredibly difficult case. And so I know the person who I never saw take accountability before. I went through the restorative justice process. You know where this is going to go. And 6 months later, a year later, this person is still walking the straight and narrow. He actually got interviewed by our local newspaper. It was a front page article about his experience of trying to sabotage. That was his version. That was his words. The restorative justice process. And here's what happened. I had another guy, former military guy, former SEAL. He got into policing before I got there with Longmont, and was very much wanting to put bad guys in jail. Great, good for him. First name Greg, I won't give you any more. But if you were to YouTube, I won't give you his last name, but people who know this, he's had over 500,000 hits as he sits there in his patrol car and swears by restorative justice in terms of what he has seen, what has changed him in terms of restorative justice. So it has turned police officers who were kind of these, again, school-skilled and trained in the art and science of criminal justice into believers, because they're drawn to victims becoming whole. They're drawn to people choosing accountability. I think we all are. And I think we all are. And that's what restorative justice offers. It offers. And it's not used, I will tell you, we use it 250 to 300 times a year. That's what we use it for. Now, when we put Rewind together, it's going to jump up to about over 1,000 times a year. So, we don't use it for everything, and there's just a lot of things. And by the way, in terms of what happened in Boulder County, we got Boulder, we got our unincorporated Boulder County, we got other cities. Every one of them, the DA now does a restorative justice process. It's kind of a diversion process. But our DA, our former DA, and then this DA, kind of campaigned on restorative justice in Boulder County. And that was what Boulder County wanted. They wanted to see alternatives. They didn't want to see more criminal justice. They didn't want to see the recidivism. They wanted to see things that were effective. They wanted to see things that made their community safe. And so that's what they ran on. The DA is also big on LEAD, the Angel Initiative, and CORE. Just today, I couldn't be there, but the chiefs and the sheriff and the DA had a conversation about how they can take these programs countywide. Because the DA wants to do it countywide. He's seeing what's happening. So, I don't know how much more time I have, but...
You have
Can I ask you a question? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, well, let's say we have about 15 more minutes, and I think there still is the question about officer training, and then, so 15 minutes for final.
Let me get back to that. I apologize. I just think hiring is the most important thing we can do. We've adjusted our training, whether it's field training officer or whether it's internal overtime training, in-house training, to ensure that they get this, understand restorative justice, understand LEAD for Angel Initiative, Rewind, along with everything else. And so, but the big thing for me is the culture, because the culture will carry the day. I mean, we can do as much training as we can do, but the culture, I think, carries the day with some of that. Yes, sir.
So I want to start by saying what you're talking about is something I've been in the system for quite a while as a defense attorney and prosecutor, now a district court judge in smaller communities, and now Lawrence and some other communities. And the position I hold now, there's a certain level of tension between ideas that I like and what constitutionally can happen. And you're talking to a group that's very active in our county that's going to be bringing more ideas to the table, all of which I think are good. I think you never get static. But I want to put some context on the outcomes and just kind of ask to address that a little bit. I don't know the website. It's called neighborhoodscout.com. Neighborhoodscout.com. It has some crime statistics for both Lawrence and for Longmont. I don't know the year. I don't know if the numbers that you're talking about sound websites reflecting. It said in Lawrence, Kansas, for whatever years reported 261 violent crimes, Longmont 331 violent crimes, Lawrence 2,664 property crimes, Longmont 2,318. In Lawrence, Kansas, you have a 1 in 371 chance of being a victim of a property crime. In Longmont, 1 in 285. In Lawrence, Kansas, a 1 in 36 chance of being a victim of a violent crime, 1 in 41 chance in Longmont. Statistically, probably no different. And so, I think there's a lot of value in how people feel about going through the system. In fact, I think sometimes that's the most value people can get out of it, whether they go to prison or whether they have an alternate outcome. But can you just address for us, you know, the outcomes that we're looking at? I mean, there's other factors that maybe none of us in this room know the answer to that affect outcomes.
And I'm okay with your data. I'm okay with what that data says. And just remember what I said earlier about the 5,000 Part 1 crimes where we were at one point and where we are now in terms of where those numbers are at. And so we've come, if we were to look at these numbers 15, 16, 17 years ago, I don't know what Lawrence's were, but probably less than, maybe, who knows, but ours would have been radically different in terms of what happened. I mean, in terms of Longmont was by far a less safe city given resources, given statistics. Let me tell you two other things that we've done with violent crime. Our violent numbers are up because we, real quickly, with domestic violence, that I consider the #1 public safety issue in our community, because more people are hurt by domestic violence than just about anything else. The residuals for kids and families is significant. Back in 1999, we had 5 women die from domestic violence in our community. Up until then, we were averaging 1, 2, or 3 women a year dying from domestic violence in our community. And so, 3 of us got together, the coalition, the Safe Shelter Coalition, a nonprofit group in the county and Longmont Police, and decided we wanted to do something different. How can we change the conversation around domestic violence in our community? And what we also wanted to do, because we realized these women that were dying, we never saw them before. We never saw them before. We never had a report on them before. And so what we wanted to do was figure out, we also, the data showed us anyway, that women typically didn't report battery until the 8th time. And so thinking that it might get more serious every time, we said, how can we interrupt that cycle sooner? So we put together a significant campaign. We developed an organization called LEVI, Longmont Ending Violence Initiative, back in 1999. And what we wanted to see were women coming forward to talk about, we wanted Longmont Police to be an organization where women would come forward, especially women, because the research showed us at that time that about 18 to 20% of these were reported. And so we were seeing maybe over 80% of the cases of domestic violence not reported. So our numbers for domestic violence skyrocket in our community. And for those of us in the cop business, you know that if you want to focus on a particular crime or a particular set of circumstances, say you want to focus on car thefts, or you want to focus on car break-ins or burglaries, and you want people to report those things, the numbers go up. We know that. We can actually make numbers go up as the police department focuses on things to make things happen. That's what happened with domestic violence. The same thing happened with sex assaults in our community. Even though the vast majority of sex assaults were occurring in families, we had a very, very low reporting rate with domestic violence, again, or with sex assaults, again, 18, 20% or something on that order. And so we basically put a lot of programs and strategies in place because we wanted more women to report their sexual assault. Our numbers are higher than anywhere else per capita, probably in the state of Colorado, in terms of sex assault. Does that mean we have more sex assaults? For those of us in the cop business, you know that probably not. We have more reported. And so we think our community is actually safer, even though our numbers are a lot higher. Because more women report earlier, and domestic violence, and more people who are sexually assaulted feel more comfortable in reporting. And so oftentimes when those things go unreported, we know that it continues So that's what we've done. And our number, you go in and look at our numbers for those cases, you're going to see they're very, very high. And that's, I don't know if that explains all the violent crime, lots of the numbers for violent crime, but our violent crime rate is high because we've done a lot of work to try to convince people to report more. And so, and we think ultimately our community is safer as a result. Any other questions or comments? I appreciate it. Yes, sir.
If this has been successful for multiple years in Longmont and has extended itself into Boulder County with the Boulder DA doing something similar thing, other places in Colorado with similar demographic size cities, are they approaching it the same way?
What's interesting is Denver sent their deputy chief up to us. They got a new chief in Denver. They sent their deputy chief up to us 6 months ago, and he spent a couple of days with us learning about the ins and outs and logistics of what we're doing with restorative justice. They haven't started yet, but the chief their Denver chief wants to down there. Colorado Springs has a fairly strong community-based restorative justice process. And I don't know what their numbers are, I just know that they show up at state conferences with lots of wonderful stories. Boulder, okay, I'll go outside of Boulder County. I know there's others. We have a fairly strong restorative justice state in Colorado. I know there's others. Those are a couple or a few that come to mind right now.
Have time for one more question if anyone has one.
You mentioned drug and mental health services for folks.
Sorry?
You mentioned drug and mental health services for folks. Do you do anything to address poverty?
Do we do anything for poverty? Yeah, I'm trying to, not really. Our community does. Have you ever heard of circles programs? It's where we actually train community members to understand the nature of poverty. And we actually work, and those people are actually volunteer to help people who are in poverty. And so once they understand it, they go through this circles program, and then they're able to help others get better in poverty. And I can't, not per se, public safety doesn't do anything with that. I can't say we do. What I do know though is we spend a lot of time in neighborhoods that are lacking resources. And like I said, I walk mostly apartment complexes and mobile home parks. And so I'm not saying that's where the poverty always resides, but interestingly enough, there's a lot there.
Have you had any kind of response back on that those neighborhoods then feel targeted by that presence?
I wish my friend Dan was here. They unbelievably appreciate it. By the way, if you want to go, I mean, there's another website called Blog Revolution Online. If you want to go to that website, you can look at a lot of the, Dan and I do a report, we take photos of we chronicle every single conversation. And we take photos of everybody who let us, most do. And those photos and those stories are on that website.
What is the website again?
Belonging Revolution. Tough one, poverty. And you know, let me just say this too. Real quickly, it's when we pass these laws on these health and social issues, or we stiffen penalties, oftentimes the demographic or the economic strata that's most impacted are the economically disadvantaged people. And so the economically advantaged people have options, they have resources that they can use. The economically disadvantaged people don't, typically. And so what happens, when you talk about racism, Dr. Gilbert talked about it a little bit, I think you gotta go beyond what we see, as I said before, the traditional system. Because when we pass these laws that are basically, we're trying to impact social and health issues, I think without intention, we impact a lot of the economically disadvantaged neighborhoods, because that's where the cops end up going. And so you end up forcing a mix of police and the criminal justice system in economically disadvantaged neighborhoods, because they don't have options. And oftentimes they do call the cops. And so I would say that's my way of looking at it, that if we have to develop new mechanisms and new structures to deal with these health and social issues like I talked about. And so that I think will lessen the numbers in terms of, and if we stop passing laws that we unintentionally impacting our economically disadvantaged neighborhoods or our demographics, I think that would lessen a lot of contact that the police have with those neighborhoods. It makes sense to me, it may not make sense to you, but that's my take on things. So.